I never believed in the supernatural until I started working the night shift at Oakwood Memorial Hospital. The pay was good, and I needed the money, so I pushed aside the whispered warnings from day staff about strange occurrences after dark. How bad could it be? My first night started quietly enough. I made my rounds through the eerily silent corridors, checking on patients and restocking supplies. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting harsh shadows in empty rooms. Around 2 a.m., I was heading back to the nurse's station when I heard a child's laughter echoing from down the hall. I froze. There were no pediatric patients on this floor. "Hello?" I called out tentatively. No response, just another faint giggle that raised the hair on my arms. I inched towards the sound, heart pounding. As I rounded the corner, I caught a glimpse of a small figure darting into a room. But when I reached the doorway, the room was empty. Shaken, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Lack of sleep, an overactive imagination. There had to be a logical explanation. I didn't mention it to anyone, not wanting to seem crazy on my first night. But things only got stranger from there. A week later, I was restocking the supply closet when the temperature suddenly plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me as an icy chill ran down my spine. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Help!" I shouted, pounding on the door. "Someone let me out." But my cries were cut short as I felt something brush against my leg. Something that shouldn't have been there. I scrambled backwards, knocking over shelves in my panic. Just as my terror reached its peak, the door swung open. I bolted out into the hallway, gasping for air. My coworker Jane found me there, white as a sheet. "What happened?" she asked, concern etched on her face. I stammered out an explanation, feeling foolish as the words left my mouth. But to my surprise, Jane didn't laugh or call me crazy. She just nodded grimly. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "There's a reason no one wants to work nights here." She went on to tell me about other incidents: call buttons ringing from empty rooms, patients describing visits from long-dead relatives, shadows moving of their own accord. I considered quitting then and there, but I needed this job. So I stayed, growing more uneasy with each passing night. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before: how certain areas always felt colder, how lights would flicker when I passed. And always that faint, childlike laughter just at the edge of hearing. One night, about a month in, I was checking on Mrs. Henderson in room 302. She was sleeping peacefully, her wrinkled face serene in the dim light. As I turned to leave, movement caught my eye. There, reflected in the window, was a figure standing behind me. A nurse in an old-fashioned uniform, her face obscured by shadow. I whirled around, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the window, the reflection was gone. My hands shook as I stepped into the hallway, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I saw her, a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, standing at the end of the corridor. She wore a faded hospital gown, her long dark hair obscuring her face. As I watched, frozen in place, she slowly raised her head. Where her eyes should have been were only empty, black sockets. I screamed, stumbling backwards. The lights began to flicker wildly as a cold wind whipped through the hall. The girl took a jerky step towards me, her movements unnatural and wrong. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the brightly lit nurse's station. Jane found me there, huddled in a corner and shaking uncontrollably. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked softly. I could only nod. Jane sighed, sinking into a chair beside me. "Her name was Emily. She died here in the 1950s of botched surgery. They say she still roams the halls, looking for the doctor who killed her." I listened in horror as Jane recounted other legends surrounding the hospital, the phantom ambulance that sometimes appeared in the parking lot, the ghostly patients that wandered the halls at night, the whispers that came from empty rooms. With each story, my fear grew. "Why didn't you warn me?" I demanded. "Why does anyone still work here?" Jane's expression was grim. "We tried to tell you, but management forbids us from talking about it openly. They're afraid of bad publicity. And as for why we stay..." She trailed off, her eyes distant. "Some of us don't have a choice anymore." Before I could ask what she meant, a scream echoed from down the hall, room 302. "Mrs. Henderson." We raced to her room, bursting through the door. The old woman was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror as she pointed to the corner of the room. "She's here," Mrs. Henderson shrieked. "Can't you see her?" I saw nothing, but the temperature in the room had dropped dramatically. As we tried to calm Mrs. Henderson, medical equipment began to rattle and shake. The lights flickered, plunging us into momentary darkness. When they came back on, there was a message scrawled on the wall in what looked horribly like blood. "You can't escape, Jane," and I exchanged terrified glances. This was beyond anything I'd experienced before. As if in response to our fear, a low moan began to build, seeming to come from the very walls themselves. The window shattered, showering us with glass as a gust of fetid air filled the room. And there, hovering in the broken window, was a figure emaciated, corpse-like, with milky white eyes that seemed to stare into my very soul. It reached out a decaying hand towards us as Mrs. Henderson's screams reached a fever pitch. I wish I could say that was the worst of it, that things got better after that night. But the truth is, the horrors only escalated. Each shift brought new terrors, ghostly patients wandering the halls, whispering voices from empty rooms, glimpses of things that should not be. The girl with the empty eyes became a frequent visitor, always just at the edge of my vision. Sometimes I'd hear her giggling, other times crying. Once, I found a child's handprint in blood on a bathroom mirror, still wet to the touch. My co-workers were little help. Some, like Jane, seemed resigned to the supernatural occurrences. Others flatly denied anything was wrong, even when faced with undeniable evidence. A few had clearly been driven to the brink of madness, muttering to themselves and jumping at shadows. I tried to quit, but something always stopped me. It was as if the hospital itself didn't want to let me go. My car wouldn't start, my phone died every time I tried to call in sick, my alarm failed to wake me. And always, that sense of being watched. One night, about 3 months in, I was making my usual rounds when the lights went out. Not just flickering, but complete darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. As the beam cut through the blackness, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. The hallway was filled with figures, patients in old-fashioned hospital gowns, nurses in outdated uniforms, doctors with grim expressions. They stood silently, watching me with hollow eyes. And at the front of the group was Emily, the girl with the empty sockets, holding out a small, pale hand. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot. As I watched in horror, the figures began to move towards me, their movements jerky and unnatural. The temperature plummeted, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. I could hear whispers building around me, a cacophony of ghostly voices. Join us. You belong here now. You can never leave. Just as the first spectral hand was about to touch me, the lights flickered back to life. The hallway was empty, no sign of the ghostly crowd. But the whispers lingered, and I knew with chilling certainty that this was far from over. I ran to the nurse's station, desperate for some human contact. But when I got there, I found Jane slumped over the desk. I rushed to her side, fearing the worst. As I shook her, she slowly raised her head. What I saw made me recoil in horror. Jane's eyes were completely black, her skin pale and waxy. When she spoke, her voice was not her own. "Why do you resist?" she asked, her tone hollow and echoing. "This is where you belong now. With us. Forever." I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. But as Jane stood, her movements unnaturally fluid, I knew this was all too real. Behind her, I could see more figures emerging from the shadows, my other coworkers, all with the same black eyes and eerie pallor. "No," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. It can't be." A cruel smile twisted Jane's features. "Oh, but it is. And now, it's time for you to join us properly." I turned and ran, their laughter echoing behind me. I raced through the corridors, passing through pockets of icy cold and stifling heat. Doors slammed around me, equipment crashed to the floor. And always, the sound of pursuit. I burst through the main doors, gasping for air. The parking lot was empty, bathed in an unnatural fog. My car was where I'd left it, and I sprinted towards it, fumbling for my keys. Just as I reached for the door handle, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, coming face to face with Emily. Up close, I could see the decay of her skin, the maggots writhing in the empty sockets where her eyes should have been. She grinned, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice a raspy whisper. "Don't you know? Once you're part of Oakwood, you never truly leave." As if in response, the fog began to thicken, obscuring everything beyond the immediate vicinity. I could hear the others approaching, their whispers growing louder. Emily's grip tightened, her nails digging into my flesh. "Welcome home," she hissed. The fog closed in, and I felt myself being pulled back towards the hospital. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. As the doors loomed before me, I had one final, terrifying thought: this was only the beginning. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the hospital sign, the letters rearranging themselves before my eyes: Oakwood Memorial Hospital, now serving eternity. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally came to, I found myself lying on a cold, hard surface in complete darkness. The air was thick with the smell of decay and antiseptic, a nauseating combination that made my stomach churn. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized with horror that I was on an operating table in one of the hospital's abandoned surgical suites. Panic set in as I tried to move, only to find my wrists and ankles restrained. The metal cuffs bit into my skin as I struggled, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps approaching, accompanied by the squeak of wheels on linoleum. A figure emerged from the shadows, pushing an ancient, rusted medical cart. It was the doctor I'd seen in the spectral crowd earlier, his face obscured by a surgical mask that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of its own. As he drew closer, I could see that his eyes were milky white, devoid of pupils or irises. "Patient is prepped for the procedure," he intoned, his voice a dry rasp that sent shivers down my spine. "Shall we begin?" From the darkness around me, more figures materialized, nurses with gaping wounds where their faces should be, orderlies with limbs bent at impossible angles, patients trailing 4 lines that dripped black ichor onto the floor. And there, standing at the foot of the operating table, was Emily, her empty eye sockets somehow managing to convey a sense of gleeful anticipation. "What are you going to do to me?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. The doctor leaned in close, his breath icy against my ear. "We're going to make you one of us, of course. Oakwood needs new blood, quite literally." With that, he reached for a scalpel on the medical cart. The blade gleamed wickedly in the dim light, and I could have sworn I saw faces screaming silently within its reflective surface. As he brought it towards my chest, I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the pain. But it never came. Instead, I felt a sudden rush of wind, and when I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the operating room. I found myself standing in a long, dark corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The walls pulsed with an eerie, organic quality, as if the very building was alive. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely. "Is anyone there?" In response, I heard a child's laughter, Emily's laughter, reverberating all around me. "Come find me," her voice sing-songed. "If you can make it to the end, maybe we'll let you go." I had no choice but to start walking. As I moved down the corridor, the walls seemed to close in, forcing me to turn sideways to squeeze through narrow passages. Sometimes the floor would tilt suddenly, nearly sending me tumbling into yawning pits that appeared out of nowhere. All the while, I could hear whispers and moans coming from behind closed doors, begging for help or warning me to turn back. I don't know how long I wandered through that nightmare maze. Time seemed to have no meaning here. My feet ached, my throat was parched, and exhaustion weighed heavily on me. But every time I thought about giving up, I'd hear Emily's taunting laughter, spurring me on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a glimmer of light ahead. Hope surged through me as I quickened my pace. But as I drew closer, I realized with mounting dread that the light was coming from underneath a door marked morgue. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. I knew I shouldn't open it, that nothing good could possibly be waiting on the other side. But some force compelled me forward, and before I could stop myself, I was pushing the door open. The sight that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my days. The morgue was filled with bodies not lying peacefully on slabs, but standing upright, their dead eyes fixed on me. Some were recent, their skins still bearing a semblance of life. Others were in various states of decay, flesh sloughing off bones, maggots crawling through empty eye sockets. And there, in the center of it all, was Jane. But not the Jane I knew. This Jane was a horrific amalgamation of flesh and machinery, tubes and wires protruding from her body, her lower half fused with a metallic contraption that whirred and clicked ominously. "Welcome," she said, her voice a mechanical rasp. "We've been waiting for you." The corpses began to move towards me, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. I tried to back away, but the door had vanished, leaving only a solid wall behind me. As the dead closed in, their cold hands reaching for me, I screamed. And suddenly, I was awake, bolting upright in my own bed, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Sunlight streamed through my window, and I could hear the comforting sounds of traffic outside. It had all been a nightmare, I told myself. Just a horrible, vivid nightmare. But as I stumbled to the bathroom to splash water on my face, I froze in horror. There, on my chest, was a thin, red line exactly where the doctor had been about to cut me open in my dream. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw a message scrawled in steam, despite the fact that I hadn't run any hot water. "See you tonight." I called in sick that day, my mind reeling as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Was I losing my grip on reality? Had the stress of the night shift finally caused me to snap? Or was there something more sinister at play? As night fell, I found myself drawn back to Oakwood Memorial Hospital, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away. The building loomed before me, its windows dark and forbidding. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw faces pressing against the glass, watching me with hungry eyes. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the doors. The lobby was deserted, the only sound the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. As I made my way to the elevator, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The ride up to my floor was interminable. When the doors finally opened, I half expected to see the ghostly crowd waiting for me. But the hallway was empty, eerily quiet. I walked to the nurse's station on autopilot, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Jane was there, looking perfectly normal as she glanced up from her paperwork. "You're late," she said, frowning. "Everything okay?" I opened my mouth to respond, to pour out everything that had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded weakly and picked up my patient files. As I turned to start my rounds, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a darkened window. For just a moment, my eyes were solid black. The night passed in a haze of routine tasks and paranoid glances over my shoulder. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat, every unexpected sound made me jump. But nothing overtly supernatural occurred, and I began to wonder if I was simply letting my imagination run wild. It wasn't until near the end of my shift that things took a turn for the truly bizarre. I was checking on Mr. Grayson in room 415 when I noticed something odd about the heart monitor. The steady beep 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 had taken on a strange rhythm, almost like words. I leaned in closer, straining to hear. And that's when I realized with dawning horror that the monitor was speaking. In Emily's voice. "You can't escape us," it whispered. "You're one of us now." I stumbled backwards, knocking over a tray of medical instruments. The crash brought Jane running, concern etched on her face. But when she saw me, her expression changed to one of understanding and hunger. "It's time," she said softly, her eyes beginning to darken. "No more running." The lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. When they came back on a moment later, Jane was gone. In her place stood the monstrous, mechanized version from my nightmare. I ran. Through twisting corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves as I passed, down stairwells that led to floors that shouldn't exist. All around me, the hospital was coming alive. Walls pulsed, floors rippled, and from every shadow, ghostly hands reached out to grasp at me. I burst out of the main doors, gasping for air, only to find myself not in the parking lot, but in the nightmare corridor from my dream. Emily stood at the far end, her empty eye socket somehow managing to convey amusement. "Did you really think you could leave?" she asked, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Oakwood is a part of you now. And you're a part of it." As she spoke, I felt a strange sensation spreading through my body. Looking down, I saw my skin beginning to turn translucent, my veins darkening to an inky black. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Emily approached, reaching out a pale hand. "Don't fight it," she said softly. "It's easier if you don't fight it." As her fingers brushed my arm, the world around me began to dissolve. The corridor melted away, replaced by a swirling vortex of memories, not just my own, but those of countless others who had been trapped here. I saw decades of pain, fear, and suffering, all feeding into the insatiable hunger of Oakwood Memorial Hospital. And I understood. This place wasn't just haunted. It was a living entity, feeding off the souls of those who entered its doors. Patients, staff, visitors, all were potential fuel for its endless appetite. As this realization washed over me, I felt myself being pulled apart, my very essence scattered and absorbed into the fabric of the hospital. But even as my consciousness began to fade, a small part of me clung to existence, refusing to be completely consumed. I don't know how long I drifted in that liminal space between life and death, reality and nightmare. It could have been days, years, or mere seconds. But slowly, gradually, I began to coalesce. Not as a physical being, but as something other. When I finally regained some semblance of awareness, I found myself standing in the hospital lobby. But I wasn't really there, not in any way that mattered. I was a part of Oakwood now, another ghost in its endless halls. I watched as a new nurse walked through the doors, young and eager, just as I had been. I wanted to warn her, to tell her to run while she still could. But all I could do was whisper on the edge of her consciousness, my words lost among the countless other voices that made up the hospital's dark chorus. As she made her way to the elevator, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished doors. My eyes were solid black, my skin pale and translucent. And behind me, always behind me, stood Emily, her hand on my shoulder in a possessive grip. "Welcome to eternity," she whispered, and I knew that my nightmare had only just begun. The elevator doors closed, carrying the new nurse up to the waiting horrors above. And I remained in the lobby, trapped between worlds, doomed to watch as Oakwood claimed victim after victim, powerless to intervene. This is my existence now. A silent witness to unending terror, a fractured soul bound to a place of nightmares. And as I stand here, watching the sun set on another day, I can't help but wonder. Will you be next to join us in the halls of Oakwood Memorial Hospital?